Hi guys, this is the second part of the video. Test your knowledge, theories of personality. If hindi mo pa nasasagutan ng first part, make sure to skip this video and check the link in the description box para sa first part ng video. Now, let's continue sa second round ng test. Number 23. Blank believe that the ideal state of human nature involves always having a certain level of tension to reduce. A. Sullivan, B. Freud, C. Murray, or D. None of the above. The correct answer is letter C. Henry Murray. With Sullivan, he said that the ideal state of human nature is the absence of tension. It's bliss. And that state of lack of tension is the ultimate goal. And Freud would say the ultimate goal is, again, sex and aggression, and that sex and aggression is all about tension reduction. Henry Murray conforms to that. It's a combination of that. The ideal state is not that you would have no tension, as Sullivan would say, but you would have this certain level of tension that you must reduce. Because for Murray, we behave in a way that we create tension ourselves in order to remove that. Let's say you're trying to create your own challenge, smoking. You don't know that you're gonna want it later on. It's just you smoke, and then later on, after a certain period of time, there's another tension. That's the pleasure you're looking for. That itch that smoking would give you. The resolution to that itch. That's what makes smoking pleasurable in the first place. That's why you wouldn't find someone who keeps on smoking and smoking and smoking all day, every day. Because you have to stop at a certain point so that a certain level of tension develops, and then when you smoke, it's real good. Which of the following theories modified Freud's concept of the provinces of the mind? A. Jung, B. Klein, C. Murray, or D. Erikson? And the correct answer is letter C. Murray. Bakit mali yung ibang choices? First, let's talk about Klein. No? The major difference between Klein and Freud is Klein argued that the provinces of the mind begins at a much earlier stage. For Freud, usually the ego and the superego, they will develop at a later point in time. But Klein would argue that id, ego, and superego develops much earlier, even during the infancy phase. As a result of this, yung infant, iba yung function ng ego niya and superego. Kasi bata pa nga siya. They're underdeveloped but it's functioning. Yun yung major argument ni Klein. But it's not a full modification kasi yung id halos the same lang, no? Same lang yung id ng infant as with Freud. So hindi niya na-reconceptualize lahat. For Carl Jung, he redefined libido. Sex drive na to, hindi na siya provinces of the mind. So based on Carl Jung, libido is a general life force rather than being limited to the sexual drive. For Erikson, ang redefine naman niya ay yung ego. So, meron siyang tatlong interrelated aspects, the body ego, the ego ideal, and the ego itself, which is what we call the center of personality. But for Murray, if you can look at this table, iba talaga siya. As in, every concept ng provinces, in-improve and minodify niya. So, aside from the concept of Freud na primitive, amoral, and lustful impulses ang id, dinagdagan niya to ng innate impulses that society considers good and acceptable. So, empathy, identification, love, and tendency to master one's environment. And for the ego, ganun din, no? For Freud kasi, the ego is just the servant of the id to gratify itself. But for Murray, dinagdagan niya naman to na ang ego kayang mag-organize and mag-plan ng courses of action independent of the id. And again, for the superego naman, for Freud, early parenting, yun yung nag-determine ng superego and yung resolution ng Oedipal complex. But for Murray, it extends to peer groups and culture, and it extends throughout the person's life, and it's not solidified and fixed at a certain age. So for Freud, kabataan mo pa lang, may superego ka na and it's fixed. But for Murray, it develops over the course of a person's lifetime. The id contains primitive, amoral, and lustful impulses. But it also encompasses innate impulses that society considers acceptable and desirable. Which of the following theories would most likely say this? A. Murray, B. Freud, C. Klein, or D. Carl Jung? And the correct answer is letter A. I explained with the last question on how Murray reconceptualized Freud, and this was just a question of fact. If I ask you that it's the shadow, then it would be Carl Jung. But since I referred to it as the id, then it's Murray. Hunger is an example of blank need. A. Proactive, B. Reactive, C. Passive, or D. Active. And the correct answer is letter A. Proactive. So sa concept ni Murray, dalawa lang naman yung needs. Wala namang active and passive. Chemical lang yan. So dalawa lang, no? Proactive and reactive. When we say proactive, it does not require an environmental stimulus. Like hunger, kahit wala kang gawin, kunwari isang buong araw wala kang gawin, magugutom ka. It arises from within. That's what we call proactive need. When we say naman reactive, kailangan mo ng environmental stimulus. Let's say, yung need mo to be free of threat, no? To be free of harm avoidance need. Ma-activate siya. Kunwari, malapit ka ng banggaan ng sasakyan, tapos tumatawid ka. Mapapatakbo ka, di ba? Para iwasan yung sasakyan. So that's an example of a reactive need. You have to react at a certain stimulus from the environment. Blank is the influence of the environment and past events on the current activation of a need. A. Press, B. Thema, C. Subsidiation, or D. Fusion of needs. And the correct answer is letter A. Press. So subsidiation, I said earlier that it's when you're trying to meet particular need and then as a result another need is activated. And the fusion of needs is almost the same. You want to be a millionaire, so you need to be really good at something, right? So that people pay you for it. But you really need to also be a good leader, so your belongingness are also met. But you also really need to be free from harm, right? Because be secure to continually pursue that. So your harm avoidance need is being met. As a result of pursuing a single goal, a lot of other needs are being activated and are being met just by behaving towards that goal. So that's an example of a fusion of needs. Malevolence, lust, and intimacy are all an example of A. Needs, B. Personifications, C. Tensions, or D. Dynamisms. And the correct answer is letter D. Dynamisms. So, concept siya ni Murray. So, it's a matter of how energy is being used by the person. So, it's an energy system, much like Freud. And for Murray, tensions, those are potentiality for actions. And then, when it becomes actions, we call that energy transformations. And then, merong two types that results from this tension, which we call needs and anxiety. Needs, they are productive. They result in productive action, like hunger or thirst na nasasatisfy and temporary, pero it results to productive outcomes. Whereas anxiety for Murray, para siyang OCD, no? Imagine OCD and may rituals ka para mawala yung itch mo to remove that annoying feeling, no? Tapos, so nag-hand washing ka kunwari. But it does not result into productive action because all it does is relieve the tension coming from the anxiety. So that's an example of anxiety. Dynamisms naman, para siyang traits and patterns, but based on Sullivan's definitions, yun yung malevolence, lust, and intimacy. And personifications, yan naman yung good me and bad me, good mother, bad mother, and the eidetic personifications. Blank is a technique for measuring the type of attachment style that exists between caregiver and infant. A. Attachment style test. B. Ainsworth attachment inventory. C. Strange situation. Or D. Caregiver-infant situation. And the correct answer is letter C. Strange situation. So now we're moving on to the object relations, right? We're talking about attachment styles. Yung tatlo, yung A, B, and D, gawa-gawa ko lang yan. And the one that invented this strange situation was Mary Ainsworth. Ilalagay mo yung infant in a room along with the mother, and then aalis yung mother, and for a few minutes, may darating na stranger, and then titingnan mo on how a infant behaves. And then after a few minutes, babalik yung mother, and then titingnan mo ulit kung paano nagbe-behave yung infant when the mother comes back. And after this experiment, depending on how the child behaves, malalaman mo yung attachment style. So we have these attachments which we call secure attachment, anxious avoidant, and anxious resistant. Depending on the kind of attachment style the infant has, that would predict future relationships. Because that's the fundamental assumption of attachment theory, is that early relationships are served as foundations for future relationships. And it serves as foundation for effective play and exploration. So the way you will relate with other people right now is determined by your infant attachment when you were a child. It's kind of sad, you know. Like, if you're having trouble with your relationship right now, it all came and started in your early relationship with your parents, and you've got no control, or you've got nothing to do with that. And it puts the burden on the parents. I don't know, I'm actually not a fan of this idea because it puts the responsibility outside of the individual and to the early relationship. Klein used the paranoid-schizoid and depressive position to represent blank. A. Normal social growth and development. B. Abnormal social growth and development. C. The relationship between the good and the bad breast. Or D. Fantasies and objects. And the correct answer is letter A. Normal social growth and development. So basically, when Klein expanded on Freud would argue that infants are not worth investigating because they have not developed a psychic life. Klein would say, no, that's wrong. Infant has a psychic life. They are functioning according to the life and death instinct. And they have an ego that allows them to reduce anxiety. So those are fantasies. The psychic life of the infant, the way the infant experiences its inner world, that's what we call fantasies. In adult form, maybe you're fantasizing about eating your favorite food, right? It's active. Right now, you're listening to me and you're fantasizing about maybe something else. That's an adult form. But in infants, it's just life and death instinct. I'm hungry, I want to eat, I'm thirsty. But it's active. It's experiencing the world already. And the objects, since us right now, if you're looking at this screen and watching me, you're looking at me as an object, a person. But for an infant, the way the infant experiences objects is by parts. Good breast, bad breast, hands, feet. It's not that developed well. It's not capable of thinking of a person yet, but it's relating to the world already. So that's what Klein was saying with these fantasies and objects, is that the infant has a mind and it's relating to the outside world in this way, through objects, by that which the aim of the drive is being satisfied. The good breast and the bad breast. And these positions, of course, since the infant is relating to the objects, right? There's a relationship. And this relationship, it's not random, it's not sporadic, it's not chaotic. It's being organized by the infant within his mind. So this is what we call the positions. The way the infant meaningfully organizes its experiences. And the paranoid-schizoid is about the splitting. The infant splits the good breast and the bad breast so that it does not annihilate it. So, merong sense of paranoia that the infant would destroy the good breast. So, that's called paranoid-schizoid. And for depressive position, ito na, nagmamature na ng konti yung infant and it's now capable of thinking that the mother is a person. And what happens is, it adopts this depressive position because it now realizes that the mother can be destroyed and can be gone. And the infant is also aware of its helplessness to help the mother. So there is this tendency to adopt this depressive position as a way of thinking about the world. Klein differed with Freud's ideas on the following concept, except A. Ego, B. Superego, C. Oedipus complex, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter D. None of the above. So the main idea to remember is Klein is a fangirl of Freud. If you say that Klein is the mother of object relations, Freud would be the father. But the major difference is that Klein emphasized the infancy stage. Not the early childhood like 2 to 4 or 3 to 5, but the early months, 4 to 6 months. And as a result of that, these concepts, ego, superego, and Oedipus complex, were different. Because we are now talking about the psychic life and the internalizations of the infant. So how did they differ? If you look at this table, you can see that the ego, Klein focused on the earlier stage, Like, Klein would say, hey, the baby has an ego and it's capable of reducing anxiety using defense mechanisms. Whereas Freud would argue that it develops at around 3 to 4 years of age. Superego. So for Klein, it develops at a much earlier stage. For Freud, it's around 5, but for Klein, it's 2.75 to 4. And it's not an outgrowth of Oedipal complex. As we've talked about in the earlier questions, Freud argued that upon the resolution of the Oedipal complex is where the superego would develop. But for Klein, it's not as such. It's more like it happens simultaneously along with the oral and the anal stage. And for last, the early superego does not produce guilt as compared to the Freudian concept, but it produces terror, as observed by Klein in her patient. The last is the Oedipal complex. Again, Klein emphasized the earlier stage. The way it was resolved, the way it will be resolved is different. Because for Klein, a significant part of this is the child's fear of retaliation from the parents for his fantasy of emptying their body. But for Freud, it's about the sexual feelings to the opposite sex parent and the hostile feelings for the same sex parent. Also, for Klein, attaining positive feelings towards both parents. But for Freud, again, it's not really about that. It's about identifying with one of the parents and then reducing the love, the sexual feelings, into tender love. And number 4, during its early stage, it serves the same need for both genders to establish a positive attitude with the good or gratifying object. But for Freud, it's not the same for both genders, right? There's the penis envy and the castration anxiety, and the way it's resolved is different. So those are the ways in which Melanie Klein differentiated from Freud's concepts. The playboy, who cannot be tied down by any woman, exemplifies this neurotic need. A. Neurotic need for personal admiration. B. Neurotic need for self-sufficiency and independence. C. Neurotic need for power. Or D. Neurotic need for approval. And the correct answer is letter B. Neurotic need for self-sufficiency and independence. So the neurotic needs, it's a concept of Karen Horney, and it resolves as a response to basic anxiety. So we have these 3 ways: moving against, moving towards, and moving away. But prior to that summarization of all these needs, Karen Horney listed 11 neurotic needs that characterize the neurotic individual. And what's the difference? How can a person with a neurotic need ever be healthy? Well, yes, all of us have this neurotic need. We have this need for power, we have this need for approval, we have this need for self-sufficiency and independence. All of us have that need. But the difference between the neurotic and the healthy individual is that neurotic are compulsive. They can't move among these other needs. So for example, for the playboy, it's the neurotic need for self-sufficiency and independence, because it's a way of proving to himself that he can get along well without others. Although you might think na lagi siyang naghahanap ng partner so he can't be alone, it's actually an expression of the contrary. It's a way to prove his independence. So it's a neurotic need for self-sufficiency, independence. Neurotic need for approval, trying to forget who you are just to get approval for the people around you. Neurotic need for power. I think this doesn't need much explanation. You just need to think about, say, Cersei Lannister, at the expense of everybody else, just to sit on the throne, forgetting morals and values. The neurotic need for personal admiration can be seen with narcissists. With narcissists, like, they always want to be admired and they always want to be looked at, and others, like, it's a need, neurotic need, because it's compulsion. It's the difference. Man is ruled not by the pleasure principle alone, but by 2 guiding principles: safety and satisfaction. Which of the following theorists is described by the statement? A. Horney, B. Maslow, C. Murray, or D. Sullivan? And the correct answer is letter A, Horney. So this is exemplified. It's been written in, it's a question of fact. Like, what would these theories say? Horney believed that neurosis is a result of an insecure childhood, the experience of basic evil, of an over-domineering parent. So for instance, your parents never approved of who you are, so you have this neurotic need for approval. For Maslow, of course, it's the realization of the self, it's self-actualization. For Murray, it's not really about safety and satisfaction. And for Sullivan, it's more on interpersonal. Any psychological differences between men and women are due to cultural and social expectations and not to biology. Which among the following theorists is more likely to support this view? A. Freud, B. Isang, C. Horney, or D. Fromm? And the correct answer is letter C, Karen Horney. Of course, it's not Freud. I mean, if you just look at the Oedipal complex, you can see that Freud is a sexist. He actually thought that women were inferior to men. And of course, it's not Isang, because, again, Isang's personality theory is rooted in biology. It's literally biological trait theory, from the word itself, biological. So it's not Isang. And it couldn't be Fromm, because Fromm looked at culture and history and anthropology as a way to conceptualize personality. But he did not really talk about this dichotomy. He did not really put much emphasis on the difference between men and women. But Horney, in her concept of the womb envy, he actually went against the Freudian concept of the Oedipal complex by saying that no, it's not biology. Anatomy is not destiny. Every difference that you're saying about men and women is just a result of culture. And one of the theorists that would agree with Horney is Alfred Adler. But in this case, the differences between men and women due to culture, it would be always Horney because of her concept of womb envy. Which of the following is not a major intrapsychic conflict according to Horney? A. Idealized self-image, B. Self-hatred, C. Tyranny of the should, or D. Both A and B. The correct answer is letter C. So again, when we talked about earlier about neurotic needs, we were talking about the influence of the interpersonal relationships of the person, resulting into these three neurotic trends: moving away, moving against, and moving towards. And the neurotic is stuck in one of them, resulting into basic conflict. Meaning, if you're moving away, of course, you can move toward. If you're moving against, of course, you can move toward. If you're moving toward, of course, you can move away. So there's a conflict between the three. While healthy people, they can move spontaneously. But in here, I'm asking for the intrapsychic conflict about the self. So we are talking now about the idealized self-image and self-hatred. So the tyranny of the should is not a major intrapsychic conflict, but it is embedded in the idealized self-image. The neurotic search for glory. It's not the glory in a sense of, winning victories or winning wars. Neurotic search for glory means you are trying to realize the ideal self. You have this ideal self, you're perfect, you're wise, you're a great lover, and you're trying to realize this in a neurotic way because it's not an expression of who you really are. And since it's impossible to realize the idealized self, and so this gap, this unbridgeable gap between the real self and the idealized self would result into self-hatred. In other words, you will hate yourself because you cannot realize your ideals. Blank results from childhood feelings of rejection or neglect by parents. A. Basic anxiety, B. Basic evil, C. Basic hostility, or D. Neurotic attitudes. And the correct answer is letter C. Basic hostility. So there's no such thing as neurotic attitudes. I just made that up. Basic evil is the experience of being neglected or rejected by your parents. Whatever that does not give you safety and satisfaction as a result, it's what we call basic evil. It's in Schultz and Schultz. And basic hostility is a result of that, right? So you get angry. These feelings of rejection and neglect. So you get these hostile feelings towards your parents. Of course, sinisigaw-sigawan ka, nagagalit sila sa'yo. So, ang tendency mo is magalit ka na sa kanila. But this feeling is repressed. Because if you express it, you might lose your parents. Hindi mo naman kaya yung sarili mo as a child. In short, wala kang choice. And as a result of this repression, it develops basic anxiety. And there becomes a positive feedback loop. The basic anxiety would make you result in a way, in a hostile manner, and this hostility would result into more anxiety. And so, medyo nagkakagulo-gulo na yung internal world mo. You develop these defenses, these neurotic defenses. They're moving away, they're moving against, and they're moving towards. And since you become neurotic, at a certain level, it becomes a neurotic way because of too much negativity in childhood. You can't switch. Like maybe you're super introverted that you don't have friends and you don't have anyone
ang pala, moving away ka na. Neurotic ka na pala. Or maybe, lagi ka naghanap ng jowa, hindi mo kayang mag-isa. Pero di ka naman pala talaga nagmamahal. Gusto mo lang ng kasama kasi naging anxious ka. Feeling mo walang nagmamahal sa'yo pag mag-isa ka. So, moving towards ka na pala. Neurotic ka na pala in that sense. The following are the aspects of the idealized self-image except A. Neurotic pride, B. Neurotic claims, C. Neurotic search for glory, or D. Neurotic search for power. And the correct answer is letter D. Neurotic search for power. So, neurotic search for glory, as I've said earlier, is this tendency to realize the idealized self-image. So you create this idealized self-image as a result of negative childhood experiences, alienation, and anger. So as a inferiority feelings. And so these inferiority feelings is resolved by thinking of yourself as some god or some higher being, or maybe a genius or a saint or a great lover. And you're trying to realize that. That's the neurotic search for glory. Neurotic claims is outside, right? It's the outside world. You feel entitled to certain things. So maybe you passed, maybe you think of yourself again as a great lover. So you feel entitled to be wanted by women. And it's not making sense to you why nobody is, say, liking you or wanting you. So that's an example of neurotic claim. A neurotic pride is inner world. It's in the inner world. It's not from outside. It's an sense of, or a high way of thinking of yourself that are not intact with reality. That's why it's called neurotic pride. So maybe you think of yourself as a really, really good psychometrician, but then you never put yourself in a situation where it will be tested so that your neurotic pride is kept. So the major difference between neurotic pride and healthy self-esteem is that healthy self-esteem is grounded in accomplishments. So maybe, valedictorian ka nung high school, and then nung college, cum laude ka, sobrang taas ng achievements mo, so medyo confident ka sa academic ability mo. That's an example of healthy self-esteem. But then again, kung wala ka namang accomplishments, tapos feeling mo ang galing-galing mo, tapos sobrang talino mo, well, you're deluded. That's an example of neurotic pride. You conceited idiot, what makes you think you can get a date with the best-looking woman in town? This exemplifies A. Self-frustration, B. Self-contempt, C. Self-torment, or D. Merciless self-accusation. And the correct answer is letter B, self-contempt. So the question being asked here is what form of manifestation of self-hatred is this person exemplifying with this statement? Right? Because when a neurotic creates an idealized self-image, it naturally follows that it's unrealistic. And it's impossible to bridge that gap. And as a result of that impossibility, the real self lags way, way behind the idealized self-image, which, as a result, makes the person hate himself or herself. And it manifests in these ways. And there are 6 of them. The first one is the relentless demands of the self. If you look at this statement, forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are. This is how you should be. This is when you compromise your values at the expense of realizing the idealized self-image. So maybe you think of yourself as a genius mathematician, and so you forget everything else and you just really focus on, di ka na natutulog, di ka na kumakain ng maayos, hindi mo na nakakasama yung mga mahalaga sa buhay mo, just to prove to yourself and be consistent with that I am a genius mathematician, although wala naman siguro siyang reality. Another one is merciless self-accusation. People only knew me, they would realize that I'm pretending to be knowledgeable, competent, and sincere. I'm really a fraud, but no one knows it but me. Another way it manifests is through self-contempt. You conceited idiot, what makes you think you can get a date with the best-looking woman in town? Again, these examples are taken from Feist and Feist. And when we say self-contempt, contempt is an emotion wherein you look at a person being contempted by as someone inferior to you. That's basically what being contemptuous means. You're looking at something or someone and you judge it to be inferior to yourself. And when you use self-contempt, it means you're looking at yourself as someone inferior, someone unworthy. Self-frustration. I must not strive for a better job because I'm not good enough for it. So self-frustration, it's different with healthy discipline, is that with healthy discipline, you're postponing a certain behavior or activity at the expense of a longer reward. So maybe hindi mo kinakain yung marshmallow ngayon kasi may promise na if you last for 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, may dalawa kang marshmallow in the end. But self-frustration, it means dinideprive mo yung sarili mo ng mga bagay-bagay. Not because merong future reward, but because of your own view of yourself na you're not good enough. Self-torment naman is kapag sinasaktan mo yung sarili mo. So, it's cutting oneself with a knife, starting a fight you're sure to lose, or inviting physical abuse. It could also be repeatedly thinking about, one's moral transgressions. Or, yung may maligang nagawa tapos you can't really stop thinking about it. That's self-torment. Another one is self-destructive actions and impulses. So it could be overeating, abusing alcohol and drugs, reckless driving, and suicide. Again, these are just manifestations of self-hatred, and they're not really na porque nag-overeat ka, you hate yourself. Right? Or porque nag-abuse ka ng alcohol, you hate yourself. It could be a result of self-hatred, but it could be something else. Like maybe it's something functional for you na it makes you forget your problems, so nag-iinom ka na nag-iinom. Or maybe it's biological na na-addict ka na. But according to Horney and her observations of neurotics, it's one of the ways in which self-hatred manifests. Break time! Alamin natin ngayon kung anong pinakamadalas na mental health disorder sa ating bansa. Ayon sa CNN Philippines, ang number 1 na mental health disorder sa Pilipinas ay schizophrenia. Ha? Schizophrenia? Talaga? Pero depression and anxiety, madalas akong nakakarinig sa mga kakilala ko na meron silang ganun. Bakit? Ang ginamit nila ay yung mga nasa hospital, government hospital, and private hospitals. Yun, makikita natin na ang mga typical talaga na lumalabas dito ay 4. Schizophrenia, substance abuse, PTSD, at depression. So, may mga ganitong tendencies na may mga hindi nare-report siguro dahil nga, kunwari, depressed ka, it doesn't usually warrant hospitalization kasi mga taong may major depressive disorder naman minsan functional pa eh. Bihira naman talaga yung nag-stay in sa hospital as full-time patient. Kung interested ka na mag-pursue ng psychologist, psychometrician, or nasa research and development sector ka, ito yun sa mga worthy of investigation as of now kasi kapag inaral mo ang mga disorders na to, for sure, malaki ang magiging impact ng iyong research. And also, dahil nga ito yung pinaka-popular, more likely than lalabas siya sa board exam. So make sure to master these 4: schizophrenia, substance abuse, PTSD, and depression. Which of the following is not included in Fromm's basic elements of love? A. Will, B. Knowledge, C. Responsibility, or D. Care? And the correct answer is letter A, will. Mnemonics dyan kay Fromm ay CRRK. So, CRRK means care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. It's a good way to think of it in a metaphorical sense. Like, suppose you're a gardener, right? And you're planting a tree. Of course, if you love that tree, you love the craft as a gardener, you want the tree to grow as tall as possible. That's care. It's an active concern towards the growth and well-being of the other person. And in this sense, you want the tree to grow as tall as possible. Responsibility, well, responsibility. It means like, since you care for the tree and you want it to grow, it naturally follows that you would tend to its needs. Hindi naman pwedeng I care about you, pero wala na, yun na, indifferent ka na. It doesn't work that way. In much the same way, kung magtatanim ka ng puno, kailangan tubigan mo every day. Kailangan hanapin mo yung tamang soil to make it grow. Kailangan i-position mo siya in a way na may matatanggap siyang enough sunlight. Or if yung lugar nyo walang enough sunlight, gagawa ka ng paraan para makatanggap ng substitute for that. So that's responsibility. Respect is, kunwari nagplant ka ng mango tree. Alam nga namang i-expect mo na grape tree siya. Tapos mag-act ka as if grape tree yung tinanim mo, di ba? In a person, it applies in much the same way na you don't use the person for your own purposes, but rather you accept the person as he or she is. And of course, inherent and implied in all of this is knowledge. Because you have to know. You can't love without knowing because it will be bounded with illusions. In much the same way na, paano mo aalagaan kung di mo nga alam, di ba? Kung di mo alam na mango seed yung tinanim mo, or di mo alam yung requirements to make it as grow as tall as possible, then walang knowledge. And walang knowledge, mahirap mag-care and maging responsible. Fromm's most basic assumption is that A. Personality is based on culture. B. Personality can be understood only in light of one's personal history. C. Personality can be understood only in light of human history. Or D. Personality can be understood only in light of one's philosophical orientation. And the correct answer is letter C. Eric Fromm emphasized our separation from the animal kingdom. That's where he began theorizing. Right? There were an instance in our evolutionary tree where we weren't so conscious, and then we developed consciousness, which made us aware of our surroundings, aware of our own mortality, aware of our own separateness with other individuals, and aware of the limits of life. All these things, as a result of this separation, arise our existential needs, which prevents us from being insane, which is grounded on relatedness, rootedness, transcendence, sense of identity, and frame of orientation. But the fundamental assumption begins with separating ourselves from the natural world. To keep humans from going insane, we need a final goal. This need exemplifies Fromm's concept called A. Rootedness, B. Sense of identity, C. Frame of orientation, or D. This is not Fromm's but Adler's idea called social interest. And the correct answer is letter C. Frame of orientation. If we talked about the final goal as a result and response to inferiority feelings, then we will be talking about Adler's goal of superiority or social interest, depending on the person's use of his or her creative power. But since we are talking about people going insane, and we're talking about Fromm, this is frame of orientation. So again, this is one of the existential needs. Typically, medyo nakakalito siya with sense of identity, but sense of identity is about your individuality. A sense of who you are. So it's more on internal. When we say identity, it's who you are, it's internal. When we say frame of orientation, it's your map and your way of looking at the world. So that's the difference between the two. Relatedness is about other people, the way you relate with other people. Rootedness is about feeling at home with the world. Because again, for instance, in our modern life, we live away from nature and away from the natural habitat of animals, and these kinds of existing gap between our psyche could be one of the reasons why there are pathologies existing in our culture. We lack rootedness. We're not connected to all that is alive. Relatedness is mostly about humans, where rootedness is about nature itself, the world. And transcendence is about, you're not just living your life. There's a purpose, there's a legacy that you're trying to build. You're creating something meaningful. You're transcending the passive existence. The following are Fromm's fundamental dichotomies, except A. Life and death, B. Life is too short to complete self-realization, C. People are ultimately alone, yet we cannot tolerate isolation, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter D. None of the above. So these fundamental dichotomies, according to Fromm, are the result of our separation from the animal kingdom, the beginning of human history. Number 43. Fromm's concept of basic anxiety is similar to blank concept of basic anxiety. A. May, B. Horney, C. Freud, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter B. Horney. Again, I'm not asking if they are the same. I'm asking if they are similar. So, one example of difference between same and similar is, in geometry. Two equilateral triangles are similar, but if they have different lengths, they're not the same. So, in a way, in terms of definition, Horney would say that basic anxiety is a sense of aloneness and isolation from a potentially hostile world. And that's the same with Eric Fromm's idea of basic anxiety, except that from Eric Fromm, it's the result of our separation from the natural world, but for Karen Horney, it's the result of our repressed basic hostility. as a result of basic evil and rejection and neglect from our parents. So they're similar but they're not the same because they come from different sources. Blank is guided by the motto, I am as you desire me. A. Receptive, B. Hoarding, C. Marketing, or D. Exploitative. And the correct answer is letter C. Marketing character. For Fromm, there are two different character orientations, the non-productive and the productive orientation. And out of these non-productive orientations results 4 different character orientations, which is receptive, hoarding, marketing, and exploitative. So receptive, from the word itself, receptive, yun yung mga taong tanggap na lang ng tanggap. So basically, they relate with others in terms of kung ano yung matatanggap nila. They rarely give, yung mga receptive character. And I think one of the examples here na mapapansin natin is, in our culture, the social scripts of women, we put them in a receptive script. So, sila yung nililigawan, tumatanggap ng mga regalo. And if it becomes a pattern dun sa relationship ng man and woman, is what happens is puro bigay na lang yung lalaki na walang matatanggap. And over time, sooner or later, nagsasawa yung lalaki kasi nga, wala kang natatanggap. And that's the same with the hoarding character. The difference between the receptive and the hoarding is, yung hoarding is kam-kam naman ng kam-kam. Hindi ka nagbibigay kasi sinisave mo siya. So, kunwari, may pera ka, tapos hindi ka gumagastos para sa mga taong mahal mo, tapos sobrang kuripot mo. So, that's one example of the hoarding character. The exploitative character is, yun naman yung mga manggagamit. No? So, exploit. Opposite naman siya ng receptive. You're using others to get what you want. Marketing is all about exchanging. Again, it's contrary to love. Because marketing, I am as you desire me, again, makikita mo dito na tinatanggal na niya yung individuality niya. And for Fromm, kapag nina-sacrifice mo na yung individuality mo for a thing or for something, it grants contrary to love as well. Because you cannot love without an identity. They think in terms of exchanges, right? I mean, love is about giving, but if you only give in expectance of you will get something in return, you're not actually loving. You're being a marketing character. According to May, the source of love is A. Sex, B. Will, C. Care, D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter C. Care. Siyempre, hindi siya A, di ba? I mean, hindi ka pa pwede magmahal ng walang sex. Pwede naman, di ba? And hindi rin siya will. Because, again, we're asking about the source. Although will is a part of love, according to May, because it springs from the individual's choice and decision and commitment to love another person. It's not the source. It just comes together with it. Care is the source because you cannot love unless you care. You have to care first. And caring means someone matters. Hatred is not the opposite of love. The opposite of love is indifference. That would be in accordance with role you made. You can't love unless you care. The person must matter to you first. Freud's theory, with its emphasis on biology and instinct, focuses mostly on blank, while Rogers' emphasis on interpersonal relation focuses on blank. A. Mitwealth, Eigenwealth. B. Umwelt, Eigenwealth. C. Umwelt, Mitwealth. Or D. Eigenwealth, Mitwealth. The correct answer is letter C, Umwelt, Mitwealth. So, merong 3 modes of being in the world according to Rollume. We call them das Sein. When we say Umwelt, it means nature. It means our relationship with nature. And along with our relationship with nature is biology. So, a theory that emphasizes biology and instinct is emphasizing nature. So, that's Umwelt. That's what makes Freud Umwelt. When you relate to the world through others, you are being in the world through Mitwealth. That's what we call Mitwealth. And another, the one that's rarely focused on by theorists, personality theorists, is the Eigenwealth. The I. How the person is experiencing the world, focusing on the phenomenology. So the way to remember this is Umwelt, nature. Mitwealth, meet others. So Mitwealth. And then eigenwealth, obviously I, self, eigenwealth. Love is a decision. It is a judgment, it is a promise. If love were only a feeling, there would be no basis for the promise to love each other forever. A feeling comes and it may go. How can I judge that it will stay forever when my act does not involve judgment and decision? Which of the following theorists are more likely to say this statement above? A. Fromm, B. Rogers, C. Maslow, or D. May? And the correct answer is letter A. Fromm. So again, when we talk about personality theories, dalawa lang naman talaga yung nag-focus sa love eh. Although si Freud may conception ng love, hindi naman talaga yung emphasis niya. But the one who really contemplated about the concept is only Fromm and May. And in this case, it's Fromm. It's written in his Art of Loving. Eric Fromm elevated love into an art. And as a result of that, we are now transcending the concept of love as a feeling. Na you fall, something that you fall into. Something that only lucky people could get. Because according to Fromm, love is a decision. Kasi nga naman, paano mo nga naman may papangako na mamahalin mo ang isang tao habang buhay, makapag till death do us part ka pa dyan, if it's not a decision? So, paano pala kung nawala na yung feelings mo, hindi mo na mahal? So, yun yung argument ni Fromm, and he elevated it into an art because what he's basically saying is, since it's an art, it's something that you must practice. As an artist, you must decide that you will choose this craft and this art, and you will practice it. Think of it like kindness. Hindi mo naman sasabihin sa sarili mo na, okay, I'm just waiting for the right person and then magiging kind ako. And then tarantado ka for the rest of the world. It doesn't work that way, right? We treat kindness as a character trait. And for Eric Fromm, it's much the same way na hindi siya tulad ng modern love na nagmamahal ka ng isang tao. For Fromm, it's orientation. You are a loving person. It's like the painter who says, okay, I'm gonna wait for the right object and I'm not gonna paint. Of course, pag dumating na yung gusto mong i-paint na object, dumating na yung Mona Lisa mo, sumasablay. And it's bound for frustration. Kasi wala kang practice. You don't know how. You don't even know how to love. But for Fromm, we must treat it like the painter na paint lang ng paint araw-araw hanggang sa gumaling ng gumaling ng gumaling. And then, tinatawag na natin siyang painter. In much the same way, yung nagmahal ka lang na magmahal, mahalin mo yung kapatid mo, yung mga kaibigan mo, yung mga malalapit sa'yo, and then over time, you become a loving person. Blank arises when people deny their possibilities. A. Anxiety. B. Guilt. C. Jonah complex. Or D. Fear. And the correct answer is letter B. Guilt. So again, this is the concept of Rollo May. So iba siya kay Freud. For Freud, yung guilt is the product of the superego, the conscience. When you do something you should not do, that's guilt for Freud. But for Rollo May, it's when you deny your possibilities, when you deny your potential, you experience guilt. Dapat magre-review ka para pumasa ka ng board exam. I mean, hindi ka nag-aral ngayong araw kahit nag-decide ka para sa sarili mong mag-aaral ka. Yung may experience mong discomfort after that day or bago ka matulog, that's guilt. And anxiety for Rollo May is about this feeling na something important to you will be gone. Usually it's an experience when you confront death. But in a much broader sense, when something important to you is facing annihilation. For Jonah complex, it's fear of being one's best. So that's a concept by Maslow, and it's typically experienced by people, and it arises when he noticed when people who meet their esteem needs somehow they don't become self-actualized. Fear is much more present. So there's got to be an object. So nakakita ka ng ahas, yung ma-experience mong yun, fear yun. For proper adaptation, syntonic and dystonic elements must be A. Balanced, B. Syntonic must only exist, C. Dystonic must only exist, or D. They are not related to each other. And the correct answer is letter A. Balance. So this is a question about Erik Erikson's theory. And the syntonic is usually the positive aspect, and the dystonic is the negative aspect. So we have different psychosocial crises that occurs at different stages of our lives, beginning from trust, mistrust, up to integrity versus despair. So if you look at this table, you cannot find this on Feist and Feist. So makikita natin sa table na to, we have In each psychosocial crisis, may equivalent na basic weakness depending on kung ano yung namayagpag. So kung puro negative yung na-experience mo, you will develop this list of negative weaknesses like withdrawal, compulsion, inhibition, inertia. And then, if puro naman positive, na-spoiled ka naman masyado, you will manifest this sensory maladjustment, shameful willfulness. So, unfortunately, wala masyadong binigay na definition si Schultz and Schultz regarding these terms. So, it's really hard to talk about them. But the point remains that you need to balance both elements. You need some amount of trust and some amount of mistrust. Hindi pwedeng tiwala ka na lang tiwala kung kani-kanino. You need some amount of autonomy, but dapat naman meron ka rin konting hiya. So, yon na dapat balanced sila. Number 50. According to Erikson, before one can love, one must first A. Gain wisdom, B. Learn to care, C. Have a solid sense of identity, or D. Learn commitment. And the correct answer is letter C. Have a solid sense of identity. The condition of two-ness requires that one must first become oneself. That's Erik Erikson. And you can see in this table that there are basic strengths as well. So each psychosocial crisis has an equivalent of basic strength. For Erik Erikson, it was implied that when you fail the earlier stage, you are more likely, it would be really difficult for you to succeed on the further ones. Right? Again, if you wala kang sense of autonomy, paano ka mag-i-initiate? Eh, feeling mo nga hindi ka nga malaya. And kung wala kang certain level of trust, paano ka magtitiwala sa sarili mo to be free and to start something? And kung wala kang identity, paano mo i-share yung sarili mo sa iba? Eh, wala kang i-share. Right? So, again, before you can love, you need to have a solid sense of identity first. So, you might be wondering siguro sa mga past relationship mo nung high school ka kung bakit hindi sila nag-work. Now you have the answer. Probably, just probably, well, maybe nag-work sa'yo, jackpot ka, who knows? Probably, one of the explanation of that is hindi mo kilala yung sarili mo. So, wag ka masyadong magmadali magmahal, no? Kilalanin mo muna yung sarili mo. That's the lesson from Erik Erikson. Kaya pa? Kaya! Click the link in the description box below for the third part of our test. Or click here. We'll see you there.